Welcome to our channel. Here, we share powerful stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the strength within each of us. If you believe in the power of true stories to change hearts and lives, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Together, let's build a community where every voice matters and every story finds its home. After spending 3 long weeks in the hospital recovering from a fractured hip, Margaret finally returns home. Every step she takes toward her house is filled with anticipation and longing. To her, this house is not merely a shelter but a sacred place built with sacrifice, love, and decades of memories. She looks forward to touching the familiar walls, hearing the old creaks of the wooden floor, and feeling that sense of comfort only a true home can give. But as she reaches the front door, an unsettling detail catches her eye: the lock has been replaced. At first, she thinks it might be a mistake, perhaps maintenance or a precaution while she was gone. Yet when she tries her old key, it no longer works. Confusion turns into unease, and unease into dread. The new lock seems to erase not only her access to the house but also her place within it. Gathering her courage, she calls her son Daniel, expecting reassurance, or at least an explanation. Instead, his voice, once so warm, is now distant, cold, almost unrecognizable. When she says, "It's me, your mother. I'm standing outside, the key doesn't work," Daniel delivers a devastating blow. "Who is this?" "My mother passed away 3 weeks ago." The words pierce her heart like a knife. Shock and disbelief overwhelm her. She pleads, trying to remind him of reality, that she has just been discharged from the hospital that very morning. But before she can finish, she hears another voice in the background, commanding Daniel to hang up. Moments later, the call disconnects, leaving her with nothing but silence. Standing at the gate of the home she cherished for 35 years, Margaret realizes she has not only been locked out of her house but also denied by the very son she sacrificed her life for. What should have been a moment of reunion and warmth turns into the first chapter of betrayal, a cruel awakening that marks the beginning of her painful yet transformative journey. As Margaret stands frozen in front of her locked home, her mind drifts back to the long, lonely days in the hospital. She remembers the night she slipped and fell in the bathroom, lying helpless until a neighbor found her and called for help. Though her hip was fractured, the doctors reassured her she would recover with time. Yet, what hurt more than the injury was the silence that followed. For 3 weeks, Margaret waited in her stark white hospital room, listening for familiar footsteps, hoping for the sound of her son's voice or the sight of her daughter-in-law's face. Each day, the door opened only for nurses and doctors, never for Daniel. She consoled herself with excuses. Perhaps he was busy at work, perhaps Melissa was caring for the baby. That fragile hope became her only medicine against the ache of abandonment. In her heart, she painted a picture of her homecoming. Daniel waiting at the door to embrace her, Melissa preparing a warm meal, and the family gathered around her, making her forget the cold weeks of isolation. But reality shattered that illusion the moment she stood before the unyielding lock. The house she had filled with love, laughter, and countless sacrifices now stood against her, like a stranger. Clinging to the last thread of hope, Margaret decides to seek out Daniel directly at his workplace. When she sees him step out of the office with Melissa at his side, she smiles through trembling lips, whispering, "Daniel, I just want to talk to you, only for a moment." But instead of the warmth she longs for, his face hardens with irritation. "You can't just show up like this. You're embarrassing me," he snaps. Melissa joins in, her words sharper than knives. "That house is ours now. You don't live there anymore. Think about somewhere more suitable, like a nursing home." Margaret's eyes well up with tears as she protests softly, reminding them that it was she who paid for the house, she who raised Daniel within its walls. But Daniel cuts her off, his voice flat and merciless. "You're old. You're a burden. We've made our decision." Before Margaret can gather her strength, Melissa delivers the cruelest act, a slight shove that sends Margaret, still weak from her injury, crashing to the pavement. Papers scatter, her cane rolls away, and her palms bleed against the rough concrete. She looks up at her son, searching for a trace of compassion, a flicker of recognition for the mother who once cradled him through nights of sickness and joy. But Daniel does nothing. He does not reach out. He simply turns away, leaving her broken at his feet. In that brutal moment, Margaret's last illusions dissolve. The bond of motherhood she thought unbreakable has been cast aside. What remains is not just pain, but the awakening of a truth she can no longer deny, that her own son has chosen betrayal over love. Alone in her small rented room, Margaret sits on the edge of her bed with a worn leather folder in her lap. The papers inside are yellowed with age, each one carrying the story of her life. As she slowly unfolds them, memories flood back, memories of a younger woman who bore the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was only in her early 30s when tragedy struck. Her husband, a construction worker, was killed in a scaffolding collapse, leaving her a widow with a small child to raise. The only thing the company returned to her was his wedding ring in a cold plastic bag. From that day on, Margaret knew survival meant sacrifice, and every sacrifice would be for her son, Daniel. She took a job as a nurse, working long hours under harsh fluorescent lights. She scrubbed blood from the tiles, tended to wounds, and held the hands of patients as they drew their last breaths. The work was grueling, the pay modest. But it was steady, enough to put food on the table and keep Daniel clothed. At night, when her body ached from exhaustion, she sewed by lamplight, patching winter coats from scraps of fabric, and saving every coin for Daniel's future. There were days when she went hungry so he could have a proper meal, nights when she stayed awake through double shifts just to afford him new shoes for school. She bore the weight of loneliness, arthritis, and cold winters, yet through it all, she found strength in the small joys of motherhood. Daniel's laughter, his drawings pinned to the refrigerator, his pride when he graduated. The house became the center of all her efforts. Each wall she painted, each flower she planted, each repair she saved for was an act of devotion. It was not just bricks and wood. It was her promise that Daniel would always have a safe haven. On his graduation day, she held him on the front porch for a photograph, his arms around her shoulders as he whispered, "You're my heart, the reason I stand here today." That photograph still rests among the papers in her folder. To Margaret, it is proof that every sleepless night, every penny stretched, every sacrifice had once mattered. The house stood as a monument to her love, the living embodiment of a mother's devotion. But now, with the locks changed and her son's words like knives in her heart, the very home she built with her youth and tears has become a place of betrayal. And yet, as she stares at the old deed of ownership, her name still clear upon it, she realizes something important. Her sacrifices may have been forgotten by her son, but they are written into the walls, into the soil, into the very foundation of the home. It is hers, in memory, in spirit, and by law. One rainy afternoon, Margaret sat hunched over the small desk in her rented room, shuffling through the folder that contained the fragments of her life. Bills, hospital records, faded photographs, each one a reminder of how much she had given and how little she had left. And then, tucked between tax receipts and old letters, she found it, the property deed. Her name, Margaret Langley, stood boldly on the page, unaltered, untouched by time. Her heart quickened. For weeks she had been treated as though she were invisible, as though her very existence had been erased. But here was proof that she still mattered, at least in the eyes of the law. The house she had built with sweat and sacrifice still belonged to her. It was not Daniel's. It had never been Melissa's. It was hers. Summoning courage she thought she had lost, Margaret reached out to an old acquaintance. Kelsey, a lawyer she had once nursed back to health after a car accident years before. Their paths had drifted apart, but the bond of gratitude had lingered. When Margaret arrived at Kelsey's office, clutching the deed like a lifeline, Kelsey welcomed her with warmth that immediately melted away some of her fear. With calm assurance, Kelsey examined the document and then looked up, her eyes filled with resolve. "Margaret, this house is legally yours. They have no right to lock you out, no right to claim it as their own. If they try to force you into a nursing home, we can stop them." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt the weight of helplessness lift from her shoulders. She was not powerless. She was not forgotten. The law, at least, still recognized her as the rightful owner. But instead of rushing back to reclaim the house, Margaret surprised herself with a different decision. The betrayal she had suffered under that roof had left scars too deep to ignore. The thought of living again within those walls, once sacred, now poisoned by cruelty, brought no comfort. Instead, she resolved to rent out the property. This was not an act of surrender, but of liberation. By renting the house, she would strip Daniel of the power he thought he held over her. She would transform the space from a site of betrayal into a source of independence. Each rent payment would be a reminder that she was in control, that her life belonged to her alone. When Kelsey prepared the paperwork and arranged the tenancy, Margaret signed her name with steady hands. For years, she had written her name on checks, forms, and prescriptions without much thought. But now, as her pen moved across the page, the act felt different. Stronger. Defiant. The house no longer defined her. She defined it. And in reclaiming her legal rights, Margaret also reclaimed something far greater, her dignity. Weeks passed, and Margaret felt a quiet sense of triumph settle over her. The house that once echoed with betrayal was no longer Daniel's to control. Instead, it became home to Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, a kind middle-aged couple with 2 children who had long admired the property from afar. Margaret watched from across the street on the day they moved in, their laughter spilling into the yard as boxes were carried inside. The sound warmed her heart. The house was alive again, filled not with lies and cruelty, but with new beginnings. And every rent payment that arrived in her account was more than money. It was proof that she had taken back her power. Daniel, however, remained unaware of this transformation. One evening, he pulled into the driveway with Melissa beside him, confident as ever. He expected the key to turn easily, the door to open as it once had. But when he slid his key into the lock, it jammed. He twisted, pushed, rattled, nothing. The lock would not yield. Inside, the Thompsons peered through the curtain, cautious but firm. Mr. Thompson stepped outside and said evenly, "This isn't your house anymore. You need to leave." Daniel's face flushed red, his pride stung by the rejection. He raised his voice, demanding entry, claiming it was his home. But the truth was undeniable. The law was on Margaret's side, and his protests fell flat. For the first time, Daniel tasted the bitter sting of exclusion, the same cruel dismissal he had once inflicted on his mother. He stood on the porch, powerless, humiliated, and locked out. The house he thought he had stolen from her now rejected him as surely as he had rejected her. Days later, Daniel sent Margaret a message. Then another. Apologies poured in, filled with excuses, regrets, and hollow promises. He begged for forgiveness, insisting that he had acted in anger, that Melissa had influenced him, that he never meant to hurt her. But Margaret, who once would have clung to even the faintest scrap of her son's affection, no longer felt the old desperation. She read his words in silence, folded the letters neatly, and placed them in the back of her drawer. Her silence became her answer. She was no longer a mother begging for love. She was a woman who had reclaimed her dignity, her independence, and her voice, even if that voice now spoke through quiet defiance. For months, Margaret carried her victory quietly, like a secret flame that warmed her from within. The house was no longer her burden, Daniel's voice no longer her master. Yet, even with her independence secured, loneliness lingered like a shadow. She had reclaimed her dignity, yes, but she still longed for connection, for the comfort of voices that understood her pain. That connection came unexpectedly. At the local library, a flyer caught her eye, "Support Circle for Women, Finding Strength in Our Stories." Margaret hesitated at first. Pride, and perhaps a touch of shame, made her wonder if sharing her wounds with strangers would only deepen them. But something inside urged her to go. When she arrived, she found a modest room filled with women of all ages. Some were widows, some divorced, others estranged from children or siblings. Each carried her own invisible scars. As they began to speak, their stories unfolded like mirrors held up to Margaret's heart. One woman described being pushed aside by her children who saw her as a burden. Another told of working tirelessly for decades, only to be abandoned in old age. Every voice carried echoes of Margaret's own suffering. When it was her turn, Margaret hesitated. Then, with trembling hands and a steady voice, she recounted her story. The hospital stay without visitors, the changed locks, the words that cut deeper than any knife. "My mother passed away 3 weeks ago." The room grew silent, every ear and every heart bent toward her. When she finished, the women did not pity her. They reached for her hands, nodding in fierce solidarity. "You are not alone," one whispered. You are not invisible, said another. In that circle, Margaret discovered something she had been missing for years, not just companionship, but belonging. These women did not see her as a burden or a relic of the past. They saw her as a survivor, a testament to endurance, and a voice that deserved to be heard. Week after week, she returned. She laughed again, sometimes until her cheeks ached. She cried without shame, her tears met with understanding instead of dismissal. Together, the women began to rebuild one another, piece by piece, story by story. Margaret no longer looked back on her life with bitterness. Instead, she embraced the peace that came with acceptance. She realized that her worth was never dependent on Daniel's recognition or anyone else's approval. Her worth was her own, carved from sacrifice, love, and resilience. In that community of voices, she found her final gift, a renewed purpose. She became a listener, a mentor, and a source of quiet strength for those still struggling to reclaim their identities. Margaret had lost much, but she had gained something far greater. The knowledge that she was seen, she was valued, and she was free. And with that, her journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and silence transformed into one of peace, dignity, and rebirth. Thank you for watching True Stories. Every story we share is a reminder that no one is truly alone. If this video touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need it, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and remember, your story matters too.